Welcome to the Indian Silicon Valley podcast. I'm your host, Jivraj, and today I have with me a very exciting guest. Join me in welcoming Rohit, who's the co founder of Darwinbox, which is one of India's leading SaaS startups and one of the world's leading global HR tech companies. Thank you so much, Rohit, for joining me. I'm really glad to be hosting you today.
No, my pleasure, Jivraj. Thank you for having me.
Great to hear that, Rohit. And it's amazing how Darwinbox's journey is different in more ways than one, especially that when you were entering the market, there was a lot of conjecture around whether or not a different player can dominate such a competitive market of sorts, right? So I want to start there and understand from you that, especially when you come from a Google consulting background, when you were looking at this market, what was the thought process like and how did you reimagine it? Because Darwinbox has now created a niche for itself and you're taking that to the world. You've taken that to Middle East, you've taken that to Southeast Asia and India. How did you look at what the market was initially and how did you cover that niche? Because I think a lot of youngsters face this problem when looking at a competitive market, but I think hearing from you would set the record straight and would be a great conversation starter.
No, I think it's a great question, Jivraj. So for us, I think at least when we started off, or when I was doing consulting, so I was at McKinsey before starting Darwinbox, right? One of the things that used to trouble me was the fact that, especially in consulting, a lot of times what you say to your customer, what you give as ideas, are very difficult to institutionalize. And by institutionalize, I mean, right, like you can go and say, hey, you should do things like this, but there is no way that will stick across. And these are large organizations that you're working with. And interestingly enough, because of my experience at Google, we had really great products probably 5-6 years before I started doing consulting, right? And that's where I thought there is an opportunity where products could help general business decisions and business choices and business execution, right? And that was a broad theme, right? And that was like a passion project for me, in terms of, even while at McKinsey, I used to keep thinking about what product would be relevant here, this customer and all of that. When I went deeper, and this was one of the conversations with the customer, which when I reflected off and spoke to Jayant about, I realized that HR tech or HR product is the one product which everybody in the organization uses, right? Like from the CEO to the last intern who joins the organization, everybody needs to use it. And when you look at the products there, or when I looked at the products there, I felt it just could do a lot more, right? Instead of being a database of information where employees' data is there, or their records of leaves and payroll is there, right? And that's the seed of Darwinbox as an idea, right? And that's where we said, clearly there is more we can do with the product. Now let's go figure out with some customers, some potential customers and past clients of ours, while we were doing consulting, on is there a real problem, right? While I know that, I mean, it could be better, but is there a problem, right? And interestingly enough, everybody we went to said, hey, either they are unhappy about it, or they are okay with it being the best product in the market, right? So, which again felt like something which we should not accept, right? And again, like, because again, all of these are large enterprises who are investing a lot of money in technology year on year, but are either unhappy or not getting the best outcome that they wish for while they spend that money, right? And that's where the idea of building an HRMS, which is much easier to use, right? Keeping adoption at the center of it. Because one of the things that we often talk about as well, right? In 2015, at least, the consumer tech world had taken off. You had great products, whether it is for cab hailing, for booking movie tickets, or for buying something online. But in the enterprise space, it didn't feel like the shift had happened, right? Like it's been the same for like last 15-20 years. And that's where we thought we can bring the best of consumer world into enterprise to solve for specific problems of HR. We could have a great product which is loved by people. And enterprise products being loved by people is not something that is quoted together, right? It's basically pushed down to people kind of a conversation, right? And that's where we wanted to bring that differentiation. We could be slightly naive at that point of time, not thinking about the market. We were like, these are large organizations who are buying such products. We'll build a better product and they'll buy us. How big this market will be, etc. We said, we'll figure out, right? Like, and that's how we started off. Over time, we realized that, oh, investors have a certain playbook, there's a certain market size, etc. But interestingly enough, this is something that played out well in terms of where we hoped that the migration to cloud in enterprises happens.
Yeah.
And honestly, it was a hope when we started off that that will happen
Yeah.
from whatever signs we could see. But it came into reality, and of course, COVID accelerated it. Long answer to a short question, but yeah.
No, I think that helps a lot, because I think like most great entrepreneurial stories, they started off with, identifying a problem, diving deeper into it, not getting bothered by things you could not possibly control, and just diving into it with a hope to create some value, which you've evidently done extremely well. And a couple of great pointers that I want to touch upon, maybe later on, because especially when you talk about the consumer centricity in enterprise products as well, that's just wonderful. But before we get there, your personal journey is also very interesting, right? Because when you worked at Google, which is a large company and very disruptive in terms of innovation, to going to, let's say, consulting, where it's, less hands-on, it's more consulting in nature. How did you wear and don the founder hat when you started Darwinbox, right? What was the kind of unlearning process that you perhaps had to go through? And in fact, what were the benefits? Because I'm also guessing that McKinsey and Google are probably one of the best, some of the best organizations to set you up for the right people and culture practices, which must have set the ball rolling well enough for the product, right? So if you can talk to us about that and how you personally had to adapt to the founder journey when you started off, I think that would be very interesting to hear, Rohit.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of credit and gratitude for organizations like Google and McKinsey for shaping me as an individual. Yeah, so I think Google definitely was one place, and this was 2007 when I joined Google, where, right, culturally, it was so different from most organizations my friends were working in terms of independence that you got as an individual to do things, right? Interestingly enough, Larry Page still used to do the final interview at that point of time for everybody. And this was 19,000 employee company at that point of time. And he used to do the final interview. It was just a 10-minute conversation, right? But it just showed how important people were for Google as an organization. And that's why they've done so well over so many years, right? Like, and you've seen spikes of companies do well, but they do well because they focus on people. I think that one is a big learning in terms of culture, right? Google was a big learning. In terms of consulting, I think one of the things that McKinsey teaches you is, right, there should be a solution to everything, right? Because consulting is all about that, right? Like you were never allowed to go to your manager. I mean, when as a first year consultant, I was never allowed to go to my manager with a problem without an answer. So whenever you go to your manager, you say, hey, this is broken, or I'm not getting this time, etc. The next question is, so what should we do? Right? Like, what do you want me to do? What do you want somebody else to do? What will you do? All of those was the question, right? So automatically there was that mindset of, okay, I'll need to resolve, right? Like, okay, I can't just go with a problem. I have to come back with an answer as well. So I think these two were like things which got ingrained in me in terms of professional work, right? What I had to unlearn was definitely both Google and McKinsey attracted the best of talent. Right. So your day one starts with working with super high quality folks who had great pedigrees or great knowledge, right? And very varied interests. So they're generally very interesting people around, right? When you start your own organization, right? One of the big unlearning was at the start, maybe you have to do with lesser number of people, right? You don't have so many answers around you, right? You might have to work with folks who fit into that salary brackets early on, right? And you probably will not be good enough to attract a lot of good folks to take pay cuts and come.
Yeah.
Right? Which means you get people with lesser experience, you get people with not so much pedigreed backgrounds or whatever that is, right? So that was a big learning or a big unlearning for me in terms of, okay, all my life I've dealt with organizations where hiring was super easy, right? I used to be an interviewer both at Google and McKinsey. And it was always that the candidate was selling in an interview process. Our first 1.5 year was we selling in an interview process, right? Like we were telling everybody why Darwinbox, why we're building this company and why they should join the company. Yeah. So that was a huge change, right? For us mentally to make that shift. To be continuously selling and getting people on board, promising them careers, because I mean, everything in Google and McKinsey was defined, right? Like you do well, you grow, all of that, right? So here we didn't even have an org chart when we started off. So what do you tell them about a career path in the organization? So I think that was one big unlearning. The other one was, I think, you realize that you don't have the safety cushions, right? Or the safety nets that they may call, right? Like, so in a consulting structure, you still have, like, if you're a consultant or a manager, then there is an associate partner, senior partner level. So you screw up, there's people to take care of that. Similarly, in Google, you have multiple levels of automation / people to take care of different stuff. Here, you know that you don't have that option, right? You're selling, you're promising something, you're accountable for building something. If you build something bad, it is your accountability, right? Like there's no 3 levels of approval or quality checks that are happening. That's a rude shock that you'll get early on. But the other good thing about that is, of course, right, like it enables you to take those risks, iterate quickly, make those mistakes, because there is no other way, right? Like you can't say I'm accountable for everything and still I'll do high quality, then you'll be very slow. So you need to just take the plunge, make those mistakes and move.
Got it. Got it. No, I think that's very interesting again, because so much of what you mentioned, right, shows in what you've built as well. And the personal evolution is also something that is being reflective, and it's very real in nature, right? I think there's no sugarcoating here. Talent is a problem at the start for founders. And so is the fact that, you have to get down and get your hands dirty, do everything that is out there. And it's just amazing to hear that from you. Moving further from there, Rohit, it's interesting how Darwinbox kind of changed the landscape for Asian tech firms or enterprise firms, where you start building for that audience first, right? Which was, let's say, a counterintuitive approach, because we hear, and the flavor of the season, for the right reasons, is building SaaS products for the world. However, considering that, you started off with a segment which needed a large amount of evangelism first, maybe consumer adoption was not as prompt as it would have been in the West. How was that journey like? What was the core insight there? Because you mentioned in the past that, HR is not the same for every organization in the world. It may depend from geography to geography. So if you can dive deeper into that insight that you had early on, and that realization, which was very candid, instead of, attempting the US first and then coming to Asia, you were head on Asia first. How did that pan out for you, and what was the insight there? Would be very interesting to understand.
So when we started off, Jivraj, like as I said, we understood these enterprises, right? Like Jayant was a banker, Chaitanya was a HR consultant, I was a strategy consultant. This was the market we understood. This was where we knew there was a problem and then we had a solution, right? So I think that was very clear. Now, once you move away from one company or one problem statement that you occurred, you start looking at it more broadly and try to see why would this make sense for a lot more companies, whether it is in India, whether it is in Asia, right? So what we realized, and this is probably from conversations and some from our own reflection, right? One, right, HR as a function is much more culturally influenced by the region than any other function. So if you take dev tools, supply chain, finance, your best practices are global, right? But we grew up in a certain power distance kind of scenario. We grew up in a certain censorship kind of a mindset, right? Where probably what is best practice in some part of the world, right? And this could be Europe, this could be US, might not be relevant in some other part of the world, right? Or in Asia specifically, right? So that we definitely saw as a problem, because a lot of the global products, when they implemented in Asia, were struggling with the fact that when they came and said best practice, either the customers didn't automate that process because they thought that is very core or central to their culture, or they changed that process and it didn't work because it was very core to the culture, right? So both of that was happening. So I think that was one place where the larger global products were not working in Asia. The second is, even if you take consumer behavior, right, it is so driven by how they use consumer products. For example, right, like if you take Swiggy or an Uber, or if you take any of the other platforms that came up, right, Flipkart of the world, the mobile usage was disproportionately higher than the web usage. And it is just because it's a constraint, right? There's not enough people who had laptops, and which was very similar in enterprises as well, right? Like a person on the shop floor, a sales rep on the ground, etc., didn't have laptops. They were never given laptops. but everybody had a smartphone. So you had to solve for the product to be easily available for all features on smartphone. The way the West thinks about products, enterprise SaaS products, is basically you have the full suite, and then they say whatever is more used, let's say for example leaves or attendance, we'll put it on mobile because you can use it on the go. Whereas in Asia, you can't do that because that's the only way they're using the platform. So even a resignation, which is a once in a lifetime activity in that organization, or an investment tax declaration, which is once in a year, has to be on mobile because there is no other way they'll access it. Don't have that, then you'll go back to paper, right? And the other interesting insight we had, Jivraj, was unlike in the West, where they buy point solution, right? Like for example, a DoorDash does just delivers food, right? Or an Uber just does cab. You take India, right? Like the Paytms of the world do airline booking, movie booking. So super apps, right? And it's similar in Tencent in China, or in a Goto in Indonesia, right? Tokopedia and Gojek, right? There is a preference for one app to do everything, right? Sometimes it is because of just a personal or a cultural preference. Sometimes it is just because the mobile phones are of lower bandwidth and lower memory, which is why you want to fix all of that into one app, right? So there was a preference to buy end-to-end products. So an HR product which does everything for me. I can apply for leave, I can refer a candidate, I can give performance review, I can look at my payslip, right? I can resign on the platform as well, right? So that's what they were looking for. So these were the three things that we saw were very different in this market compared to what was available in the West, right? And of course, right, these were not ahas on day one, but one after the other, we started realizing these. And then we thought, hey, because most of the global products were not solving for this, and it itself is a large problem, right? This is worth solving for, right? This is worth going after. Now, the question that everybody asked at this point of time was, is the market big enough? Will Asian companies pay for these technologies?
Yeah.
Right. The other insight we got through this journey is all regions go through their own cloud adoption journeys, right? So let's say US is at 60-65% cloud adoption. India is at a 20-25% cloud adoption. And when you go through those journeys, the initial adoption happens for horizontal products, right? So if you take the US market, the largest products in early 2000s or till 2010 were Salesforce, which is across sectors, was Workday, which was across sectors, was ServiceNow, which was across sectors, right? None of the point solutions or vertical solutions made it big. As the market evolves, right, where there is enough companies who are taking cloud, right, and you get to 65-70% cloud adoption, suddenly different kinds of bundling happens, right? You either bundle or you become a software for one function, which is I'm everything for HR or I'm everything for finance, or you become for one sector, which is, for example, a Zenoti case, right? For a spa, you're everything, including payroll, CRM, finance, everything.
Yeah.
Right. So you suddenly see vertical software, niche software, all of that pan out once the adoption levels are high. At least from what we observed of the market in Asia, we were still earlier in this adoption curve. So the largest products that were going to be built out were the horizontal products, which cut across all sectors.
Yeah.
Once the basic level of adoption, right? And generally there are fundamentally three systems of record, Jivraj. So one is system of record of finance, which is your accounting software. Second is system of record of people, which is your HRMS. And third is the system of record of a customer, which is your CRM.
Yeah.
Right. So any organization going through a digitization process first takes these or solves for these, and then adjacencies of these, and then the others.
Right.
Right. So that's the other thing that we realized over time on saying, okay, as these markets evolve, we are in the best place to solve for a horizontal product. Right. There was one part of your question which was also on, like, was it difficult? Of course it was, right? Was it more difficult than the US? I don't know, right? Because we don't know the US at that point of time, right? Like we were just told entrepreneurship is hard, and we just like kept on at it and it worked. Right. But I think to credit to Indian enterprises, right? I think there has been a huge shift in thinking, in terms of investing, in terms of technology and cloud in specific, and COVID definitely accelerated that.
Fair enough. No, I think that's evidently clear, and I love the structured approach to how you have gone about, let's say, understanding what the market needs, building that out, and then reiterating on the observations that you've gathered from the market. So I think that's a great cue for any young entrepreneur listening in. And Rohit, that prompts the question that maybe the adoption curve in the 0 to 1 was different, and so was it in the 1 to 10. And now that you're in the 10 to 100 journey, it's going to be different. How does your mindset as a leader change in these aspects, right? What have you done differently as a org in these different phases of the company journey? Because I'm guessing that COVID drastically increased the rapid adoption of the product as well, because digital enterprises now realize more than ever that you have to do this. This became, I guess, one of the primary use cases for any enterprise, right? So talk us through what the growth cycle has meant for you, and how do you navigate each different things, and what are the scalables, non-scalables that you maybe take care of in the different phases of your company building journey?
Got it. It's a very long answer if I just think about it, Jivraj. But like, let me try and take a shot, and please feel free to push me on any direction which makes sense. Right. So, in terms of the 0 to 1 journey, right, for us, I think was two parts. Right. One, while we had this vision of, oh, it's an easy to use product which is very configurable for enterprises, which Asian enterprises will use, right? We were not sure till we built it out. Right. So one major part of the discovery, if you may, in the 0 to 1 journey was, we have a great vision for a product. Can we just bring it out into the market first? Right. Like, can that be built out in the way, right? Or just it is limited by that category that all products end up looking like that. Right. So that was one question we had to answer to ourselves, right? And we didn't even raise money till that point, because we were like, we don't want to get committed to this idea till we know that we can execute on this.
Yeah.
Right. So we invested our own money to get to that product and get that out of, right, like in terms of build. Right. And once it came out and we were able to test it with a few customers, few potential customers, saying, this is how this looks, right, as a product. This is how easily you'll be able to do this action or that action or that action. Right. And you'll have choice of doing this in 5 different ways, was the first part of discovery, right? Like, till then it was more around, right, keep continuously talking to the market, keep figuring out insights, coming back, inform the product, and product is being built. But the product is not out yet. Till the product is out, we don't know whether what we thought about the product will actually come into fruition. Right. So that was one part of the first half of the 0 to 1 journey. The second half of the 0 to 1 journey was, will this be bought? Right. Okay. We've executed on all the parts where it is easy to use, it's configurable, it's new age, we'll bring best of technologies and all of that. But whatever we heard before we built this, in terms of this is the gap in the market, etc., will this be bought?
Right.
So that was the other second part of the 0 to 1 journey. I think one thing that we did well, right, and Jayant and I used to do this, right. We used to do like 4 demos a day each. And any HR person, right, whether that person is a buyer, they have a need, not have a need, etc., we used to do a demo. Right. And continuously we used to get feedback, we used to get inputs, etc. But what it also did, on the other hand, is a lot of people got exposed to Darwinbox as a product.
Yeah.
And HR as an ecosystem is quite connected, right? Like they talk to each other, etc. And that's where a lot of people, when they look for an HRMS, actually check in their WhatsApp groups. And a lot of people said, hey, I heard Darwinbox, I looked at Darwinbox, it seems interesting, why don't you check it out, etc. Right. So while we did these demos, and while I think the first 45 customers, both of us only sold, we were also figuring out what is the best way to sell this product, right? What can we say? What is the messaging? What happens when the incumbent is a large global player? What happens if the incumbent is an inbuilt software? Like all of those exceptions we figured out, and we started solving for, right? So I think that was the 0 to 1 journey, right? Where a lot of it was us being hands-on
Mhm.
and figuring out what we thought was the product and the concept and the company itself playing out, right? Like, so once we got to the 0 to 1 journey, it was about saying, how do we take this and build it into a company, right? Like, it was still not a company, right? It was a few customers using the product, were happy with the product, etc. But like, then you needed to think about, oh, right? Like, if I didn't sell this, what will happen? If somebody else builds this or somebody else is managing the product, what will happen, right? Like, so that part of the journey was a lot around getting some good folks and trying to scale this up,
Mm.
right? Which meant that the first, like, a lot of the first set of customers came from our brute force of finding networks and everything, all of that, right? The second set was, I have 4 sales folks, can they each achieve their quota,
Yeah.
right? Is there enough in this company and product that all these 4 people can achieve their quota? There
Yeah.
are 3 product managers,
Mhm.
can they build these modules with the vision that we had as individuals? And then there are these account managers that I have, can I manage these clients without
Well,
me actually being there,
yeah.
right? So you're becoming from a product or a concept into a company, right? Like, so that's where the next shift happened for us, right? And
Yeah.
obviously, right, in this stage, a lot of it was around, right? Always we used to punch above our weight in terms of customers. We used to say, hey, right, like, if we did a 5,000 employee client, we used to try to get the 20,000 employee client, right? We just kept pushing that envelope on the larger the client that we get, right? And a lot of times, we used to realize either once we sold or just before when we sold that, hey, like, we have to do these 10 things to get this client, right? Like, both in terms of
Mm.
product, in terms of security, in terms of contracting, in terms of how we manage the customer. Like, customer would come and say, you sit out of my premises and do it for the next 6 months, right? And at that point of time, I would have probably one implementation person doing 4 projects, right? If he sits out of a client office, what will the other 3 projects happen?
Yeah.
So you're almost becoming a company where, you need buffers,
Mm.
right? What if somebody falls sick? You need to manage that situation, right?
Yeah.
So that 1 to 10 journey was a lot of that. I think, again, I probably break that up again in terms of the part where people are able to sell, and
Mhm.
the part where the people are able to sell and execute without intervention from the founders, right? I think
Yeah.
that shift had to happen,
Yeah.
right? And it was still a lot of hustle, in terms of, because these were individuals heavy lifting the outcomes
Yeah.
rather than processes that are there in place, etc., right?
Yeah.
And I had read somewhere that once you're a $10 million ARR company, you can't die, right? Like,
Yeah.
you might not be great, but
Yeah.
you can't die, right? You will just, right?
You'll
There's no survival problem because there's recurring revenue of a certain amount of money that's coming,
Yeah.
right? So that was a landmark, and we told ourselves that, hey, we'll grow from 1 million to 10 million in the 2 years, right? We announced that in all hands. We used to share our revenues with everybody in the office, right? And there were people in the office who used to ask, saying, are we hitting the 10 in, right, like, 6 quarters
And
from now, 5 quarters from now, two
yeah.
quarters from now, etc. Luckily, we hit that, right? We planned to hit it in 8 quarters. We hit it in 9 quarters because of COVID's first quarter.
Yeah.
But then again, right, from then on, after the 10, it was all about scaling, right? Like, can this be done replicably without being dependent on people, purely in terms of how we set up things, right? Like, this is starting from how we hire good quality folks, to how we deliver to a given client, to how we sell to a client, what we say in a marketing conversation, what we say to a customer, all of those things, right? So a wide variety of things which we hustled through and were very individual dependent,
Mm.
and we just do it structurally through process, right?
Yeah.
And that discovery continues to happen, right? Like,
Yeah.
can this happen at scale, etc. The other big shift that happened was going global,
Mm.
right? So around, like, just before we hit the 10 million mark, and maybe 2 quarters before we hit the 10 million mark, we launched Southeast Asia, right?
Yeah.
Which again was a different problem statement, because one, I think, we strongly believed that sales and customer success roles should be in the region,
Mm.
right? And while we went out and said, hey, we are going to do Southeast Asia, right? literally when we landed there and started hiring, we realized that Southeast Asia is like 8 countries.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, it was not as fungible as we thought in terms of launching that market. So we
Right.
had to hire in 4 different countries because of language constraints. So English didn't work in all these places,
Yeah.
right? Which meant the product also had to be language agnostic, where new languages can be added to the product, right? Which
Right.
we did as well, right? The tweaks to the product were minimal because I think the market construct was very similar to India, where
Yeah.
right, it was still we were competing with the large global players in the enterprise space, where uh, the cloud adoption was low, right? So at least for us, we already had answers to every exception that used to come. Hey, how
Yeah.
are you better than SAP? How are you better than Oracle? How are you better than Workday? Right?
Yeah.
We are presently on this system. How do we migrate? Right? We would say, hey, we've done it 40 times or we've done it 30 times.
Yeah.
We can do it. So we went in with product being ready, but the whole messaging had to be very different. Similarly in Middle East, right? So that's the journey we went through in terms of that maybe 1 to 10 and 10 to 100 kind of modes.
Got it, got it. No, I think I love the comprehensiveness there and the fact that, each phase presented a different challenge, which was navigated in a different way, but the core fundamentals remain the same, wherein you were close to the consumer, reiterating and just like punching above your weight, as you mentioned. So I think that with the constant uh, flow of doing that and, managing other things is my cue there, and wonderful to hear that. But it's interesting how you mentioned about, building the org, and that's a different perspective to going from like a company with three people starting a company and selling something vis-a-vis, building an org for the future. Talk to us about, what the talent pool meant, because I'm guessing at the time SaaS was still not as big as it is right now, right? It would be drastically easier in comparison to hire for SaaS talent. But considering that, you all had prevalent networks, did it get any easier? What were the kind of people that you were looking at, and how did you build the V1 of the team versus how you look at it currently, just in terms of a change? Because you also spoke about the importance of process now, right? So you maybe don't need as many hustlers, and you need folks to keep their head down, deliver, execute, and just keep that cycle and engine going. So if you can maybe talk to us about what talent meant for you as an acquisition channel, and how you looked at that aspect when the company was growing and while you were building up the org, that would be super interesting, Rohit.
So I think in terms of talent, Jivraj, so the early days, I think it was a mix of two things, right? One, luckily, because you're in consulting roles or you've gone to B schools or your undergrad schools, etc., you generally, if you're above average social person, you'll know a lot of people, right? And when you deal with different functions, right? Like for example, when we hired our first salesperson, right? What would work as a persona is only thing we understood, right? And then you have to go back into your network and think who would be probably the best fit here, right? Not exactly about who has done this before, but who would be best fit here, because in your network is the person you can convince to take a pay cut, take ESOPs, who will believe that you will build a large company and come.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of the early initial hiring was like this, right? Which is network plus one, network plus two in terms of connections, right? Degrees of separation, and going to them and selling, saying, hey, right, this is going to be a large company. SaaS is the future, right? While you don't see it today, it will be, right? And trust me on this, join us, right? Like, so that was broadly what we were doing. The biggest difficulty we got was on product and engineering,
Mhm.
because this was slightly more fungible as a resource, right? So B2B was never sexy, right? B2C, obviously, you see the product day in and day out, your parents, your families, and I mean, it's immense how much influence that has on your decision, right? Like, and so that was tough to get because one, we were not in Bangalore, right? Like we were in Hyderabad.
Yeah.
And second, we were not a B2C company, we were a B2B company. And then third, we were an enterprise B2B company, which was less heard of even at that point of time, right? So while like in sales, customer success, etc., broadly the archetypes we worked with or we got on board were consulting types, which we knew or worked with or have friends in. Product engineering was still a lot more about, right, talking about what are the cooler things we're going to do in technology, right? Like, because the problem is that SaaS on the front might look like they're solving a basic problem, but what goes behind in terms of scale, in terms of technologies, in terms of how you architect, how your design is, data design or data table designs, is very, very deep, right? So explaining that to people on saying why this is big, right? And for some folks, why this will be the future, right? So was a big part of how we thought about talent. I think as we grew, Jivraj, we've done a lot of experiments, right? We tried freshers, we tried laterals. We have a lot of HR functional folks who work as HRs in organizations but are looking to make a switch, right? And some of these functions like HR and finance, you get straitjacketed, especially because those are very functional as roles, right? Broadly, your impact is very high, but you're still HR, right? Like it's like that. So for HR folks, for example, to try sales, to try product, to try customer success or account management, this was a beautiful opportunity because this is where they can speak the language with customers, right? So suddenly that became a very interesting talent pool, right? Consultants, HR folks became very, very strong talent pools. Customer success, product marketing, etc., were still not available in the market, right? Like if you look at US as a market, you'll have a lot of people like that, but India didn't have as many.
Yeah.
Right? And then suddenly you have large talent pools, which are there in the US but not in India. And how do you figure that out, right? So then we said, okay, we'll hire from campus. We'll hire really smart folks from B school who will figure this out.
Yeah.
And what we can do is give them exposure to the best of US work that happens in that domain, right? And suddenly that became a way to create great product marketing folks, great customer success folks, etc. Right? So we shifted from getting friends and network folks to grooming people ground up for a certain functions. Now I think we are in a position where we are clear about what we want in terms of personas, right? So I think that's been an interesting journey in terms of moving from generalists to specialists.
Yeah.
Where we had initially generalists who could do a lot of things and who would grow into a certain function and start leading that function, to now we know what exactly we need. Right? If we say we want a solution engineer, they'll do this. If we want an integration engineer, they'll do this.
Right.
And our ability to hire from the market, both in because of the brand growing up and our ability to articulate what we need, is better. Suddenly becomes like more structural, right? In terms of process where there is a JD out for every role that is there. It's not like, hey, I met this person, they're great, let come on board, we'll figure it out, right? That happens much lesser. But I think the good thing, Jivraj, and because you mentioned this, bringing this up, in a org which is growing in multiple geographies, there are always the 0 to 1s and 1 to 10s happening as well.
Right.
So there's a new org that you want to launch, new region you want to launch. It's an interesting 0 to 1, right? So all the good folks who are good at 0 to 1 or the 1 to 10 journey, you can reuse them in those places.
Interesting.
Who might not enjoy the 10 to 100 journey, right? They might not enjoy the process / governance / scale up journey, but they like the 0 to 1. And those folks, when you're growing 2x or 3x year on year, you'll always find the 0 to 1s.
Right.
And there are others who did the 0 to 1 but want to do the 10 to 100, who will need to be coached, who will need to be trained on those front, and that can also happen. So both exist, right? But I think even I'm reflecting for the first time on this.
No, that's very interesting, because I often tend to ask folks as to how they maintain the balance between process and innovation, because innovation is a strength at the start, and that can tend to become a bottleneck in times of scale. But it's great to know that, in fact, putting it in the way that you did, that you always have that 0 to 1 going on in some shape or form, right? So if you can keep recycling within the org, that becomes the answer to many questions. That's interesting. But the entire perspective, I think, that is a great outlook on talent. Just one very quick factor there, Rohit, on an abstract level, right? Like, so much of the piggybacking in terms of organizational structure is done from, let's say, already established structures which are there prevalent, right? You've maybe heard of a Freshworks had done this, or a US company, or Workday's done this, right? How do you maintain the small company mindset, or the fact that you don't go above board and start hiring for verticals which may not even be required, right? How do you maintain that kind of, I don't know, balance between first principles in org design, which may not be required to begin with, where you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but how do you maintain the balance between the roles? I don't know, on a broad level, trying to understand that from you.
No, I think it's a great question at two levels, Yuvraj. So one, I think context is super important, right? Like when you're mimicking or aping or even trying to get inspired by other organizations and their structures, right? Like it's very, very different, right? Just because customer success is a role that is there in large SaaS companies. If you do that in the first year, basically you're doing support, but you're calling it success, right? And so suddenly you'll realize that there is a huge dichotomy in terms of what large organizations need as structures, because they're dealing with larger clients. There is a certain scale problem that they are trying to solve, because there is enough out there in each of those specific niche roles to do, right? Versus in terms of a young company where a salesperson writes the contract, does the pre-sales, does the sales, does the emailing, cold connect, everything. And then you build specializations in each of these, because there is enough work for each of these. And then you want the individual to do what that person is best at. And that's what I was saying, right? The movement from generalists to specialists should happen naturally. Where you're saying, oh, this person is a great closer. What is this person doing today? Oh, he's spending 50% of the time doing cold calls. Oh, I need an inside sales team, right? So that 80% of their time they do closing. Right. So I think that's where like things start breaking. So every time we start, and we do this even now in new geographies, right? Like we start with the same team selling and implementing. Then first we split sales and implementation. Then implementation and customer success and support, right? Like then we go as and when you hit a certain threshold where the person is not able to do what they are good at, you get there. The other thing, and I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing, right? Three of us are extremely hands-on even today. So we play our roles very specifically. We go deep, which penetrates a little bit in the culture as well. Right. A lot of times when a client escalates or when we need to take a decision, we take our time to go through the details before we get to that answer. Right. So what that percolates down as is also that they'll come much more informed into a decision-making conversation. Right. At all levels. Right. So there is a downside of this where probably we are playing one level lower than our roles. Right. But like if you can maintain that balance, it's a tough one to maintain. I think that's the ideal structure, right? Like, so a lot of feedback that we get is all of us play one level lower than what our ideal role should be, right? But the other advantage is we never hire too much in advance. And it's an advantage I'm calling out, because then the roles open up naturally rather than things falling in between.
Got it. I love the cognizance there. I think there's a lot of acceptance there of the current process that is there, what needs to be changed and what needs to be done. And that just shows in your structured answer. So that's something that I'm going to take back. And as we move ahead to the concluding portions of the conversation, I'd love to also understand your perspective on culture, right? Especially not in the way that, traditionally we define culture, but in ways that have you probably applied in terms of scaling the company, especially with components around the product innovation that stands core to the company and a bunch of other factors in terms of ensuring that the mission orientation is very evident, right? Because with each passing year, I think Darwinbox has dominated another milestone, right? And as you now go to the global milestone of expanding to the West and other geographies, how do you scale that mission orientation towards, let's say, the most bottom level of the organization, right? Because it's very easy to get thrown off by micro tasks and not have the macro vision. But how do you perhaps do that as a leader and as the founders? That would be super nice to know.
Yeah, awesome. So there are three guiding principles in a way for us in terms of what we say, right? And I'll come to how we function, right? I think one is in our name, right? Like as a Darwinbox, one thing that we write across all our offices in big bold blue is right. It's not the strongest or the fastest or the fittest who survives. It is the one which is most adaptive to change, right? So I think that in terms of the Darwinism or Darwinianism or right, like why we have it in the name, right? So I think we are not lost on change, right? Like I think that's something that we are very, very ready for always, right? Like that's what we tell ourselves every day, that tomorrow somebody else can come and replace you unless you are ahead of the curve, right? So I think that's one constant, if you may, paranoia or excitement that we have in terms of product innovation, etc. Right? Like we need to be ahead of the change, right? If COVID is happening, we need to know what products will be used post COVID, and we should be building that first, right? Like so that's one thing that we do. In terms of vision and mission, I think one right, like vision also is two parts, right? One, the stated mission, of course, is to transform the interaction between workforce and technology, right? Like how people interact with organizations and technology, we want to transform. Uh, the other bit is we wanted to build a global product for Asia, from Asia for the world, right? And I think that again dominates a lot of our conversation and mind space in the organization, right? Like because most people are so used to seeing SAPs and Oracles, etc., versus an Asian product which is globally used is very rarely found, right? Like, and especially in the enterprise space, it's even lesser, right? So I think that's again a vision statement that it penetrates the organization's ethos a lot, right? Like, and that exists as a. The third thing is in terms of tactically, and I wouldn't say it's so tactical, but we always have a very strong revenue orientation towards a certain goal, which is a stretch. And we don't shy away from talking about it internally in the organization.
Got it.
Right? We say we want to get to this number by this time, right? And all of us, and every quarter when we do an all hands, we talk about where we are, right? And we say whether we had a bad quarter or a good quarter in that quarter, right? And what was done well, what didn't do well, what logos came, what will it imply, all of that, right? Like, so I think that again culturally helps, where everybody in the org knows what's happening, right? A bad quarter is not something that is only there for a few people to know about. Right? Everybody in the org knows it's a bad quarter. Everybody on the org celebrates when it is a good quarter. Right? And we ensure that these celebrations are much more than the funding celebrations, etc. Right? Like a good quarter, good revenue quarter, etc. is something that we celebrate much more than a funding or a funding announcement. So I think that again, very part of the ethos in terms of very strong revenue orientation. What we take down as values, right? Like for our organization, again, are very specific, and it again reflects of what I told, the three things, right? Whether it is taking high levels of ownership, whether it is being very agile as an organization, right? Whether it is being very customer centric, right? And we are able to tie up all of these values back to one of these three things. Right? Why should we be innovative? Because we should be ahead of the change. Why should we be customer centric? Because that is the only way we'll grow and build a world-class product. Right? So some of those, right? Then, I mean, what we call out as our values is less important because it is like it's almost assumed.
Becomes
right? So then the word doesn't become like it's no longer important. It is about why we are doing it, because of a certain vision we have and a certain purpose we have.
Got it. No, I think that's fantastic again, simply because I think it ties back that each micro action has a macro vision to it. It has, perfect alignment within the org. And so it becomes almost second nature to everyone within the company, I'd say. So I think that is what stands out from that entire answer. It's just like the horizontal and vertical there, wherein, everything is aligned is my major takeaway. I think, Rohit, this has been fun, wonderful in its entirety. But as we conclude the episode, I'd love to, ask a similar set of questions that I end each conversation with. This is a more founder-centric, more persona-centric. The first one there is that since that, you have rapid learnings across the board and you've been through structures which help you reiterate on top of it, how do you think you have been able to adapt the learnings that as a founder you've been taking? Because we all hear these phrases that, you make mistakes once and you learn from them. If you can talk us through the principles that you apply to ensure that your learnings are not lost in the wind and are somewhat tangibly useful through the journey, and how that has contributed to you as a person evolving to who Rohit was when Darwinbox started to the current version of it, I think that would be super helpful for all founders listening in.
Yeah. So I think one biggest source for my learning, Jivraj, has been in terms of speaking to other founders, right? Like, and I've been lucky, and I do think SaaS is one area where, interestingly enough, or thankfully enough, a lot of founders are well connected. I don't know about the other sectors, but like in SaaS, like a lot of very good conversations happen, both in terms of tactical things and also strategic things and also personal things, right? Like, how do you think about energies? Or like, there is a lot of friendships which result in us learning from each other quite a bit, right? Like, so I think that has been the biggest source of inspiration or learning in general, right? Like, because one is, of course, there are others who've gone through the journey, but there are enough people who are candid about sharing these things, right? And as much as you can learn from others' journeys and mistakes, you would probably avoid them once, right? I don't think you can completely avoid them, right? Because again, your context is your own. But I think that definitely helped. So that's the biggest one. The second, I think, is one of the things that kept me sane is I have my own interests in history, right, in philosophy, etc., which I continue to enjoy, right, and obviously use whatever relevant wherever possible to tell my stories to folks, to explain to them what has been my journey or what is expected of them, all of those things, right? That has helped, again, right? Like, I'm a huge podcast listener, right? So that's why I'm thanking you for doing this in general, because I think I think long form is definitely one of the best ways to learn, because at least context is not lost, right? Like, I think the biggest advantage that I've seen with listening to podcasts or reading books over reading listicles or articles is that, right? Like, where there's a context to everything you say, right? And then it makes it a lot more relevant. So I think that has been what has helped in general. The other big thing for us in general is the folks we've got on board, Jivraj. So I think we've been lucky enough to get really good folks join us, who are better than us in many ways and have told us how to do things, right? Like, and I think that is extremely helpful again, because right, like, while one-off advisors and one-off books, etc., you get to learn a few things. If you're working with somebody, they are playing at a certain level which is much higher than yours, right? Just by watching or by getting feedback, you can learn a lot more. And in that form, I think we've been lucky to get a lot of good people on board, right? So we'll take some credit for selling the idea to them, but after that, I think credit to them for building such great org and also helping us grow in the process.
Fair point. No, I think all of those pointers are wonderful. Just quickly there, as an add-on, is how important is it to accept and be deliberate about this process, right? Because as founders, you can tend to, have your hands muddy all the time, and there's, I'm sure, a crisis to solve every next minute, right? How do you still say, let's say, accept the fact that you need to have a support system, be deliberate about the kind of people you surround yourself with, and also, continue to have your own personal interests so that it accounts to the benefit of the org eventually, right? Because if you're not at your best, if you're not self-reflecting, if you don't know enough or aren't learning, I'm guessing you're not growing anyway. So if you can maybe just talk about the ideology behind doing whatever you mentioned, that will be a great emphasis on why it's important to begin with.
No, I think right. We're all three of us are running a company for the first time, Jivraj, and like, we're very, very cognizant of that fact, right? Like, so just because we founded this company doesn't mean we know how to run it, right? Like, I think that is at the base of whatever I say, right? Because even in conversations, right, while it is important to put up a brave face, right? And I don't want to take that away from anybody, right? Like it's important as a founder to put up a brave face when the team is nervous or team is under chaos or team is restless, right? It is as much important to say, hey, I don't know this, but let me figure this out for you, right? Like I think that right, both of that are important, right? I wouldn't be a proponent of either individually, right? Because I don't think you can always say I don't know, right? Which obviously limits the ability of team to come to you, right?
Yeah.
Like if you keep saying I don't know, they'll not come to you, right? Like, or not the other extreme where you say, hey, whatever I am telling you is the right thing, right? Just follow, right? So I think somewhere the balance is there in between,
Mhm.
right? And I think one of the things that I realized is when you keep that balance, and when you are ready to say that, hey, I don't know, I'll figure it out and come, etc., or hey, I think this person knows this better than me, why don't you ask that person? Everybody does that,
Yeah.
right? Slowly again everybody starts doing that. I mean, accepting that they don't know and all of that. I think that's the thinking. I mean, I don't know if there is an ideology below all of this. I think right, like I think one of the things that McKinsey has taught me, right, is right, like you can learn anything, right, if you have the sufficient level of interest and drive,
Yeah.
right. But it obviously starts with saying, hey, I don't know
Yeah.
about this, and then you say, hey, I want to learn everything about this, right. And that's where I'm saying that's a journey from when you say I don't know to
Right.
when you get to know about it, and people knowing that you're in that journey is fine,
Yeah. Fair.
right. This extreme or that extreme might not be a great place to be.
Mhm.
I know everything to I don't know and I don't want to know, right. Somewhere in between, if you are, is fine.
Absolutely. No, I think that's beautiful to hear because it acknowledges the fact that it is a learning journey and nobody knows it all. And you have to just accept that. I mean, each person's formula will be different to getting to that eventual goal. But the fact that you can accept and keep working on it is the beautiful aspect. And I love how candid you were in explaining it. So kudos to it. I think this has been fantastic, Rohit. And as we close it down, I'm not sure if I can find a fitting end, but on a more stereotypical level, but going back to the roots of why you started, perhaps, right? If you can maybe talk us through what remains to be your core motivating factor, driving force as you come to work every day and build Darwinbox in its current form. I'm sure these factors around building for the globe and building a disruptive company and adding value are the primary ones that motivate us as supporters to be behind your back and be your greatest cheerleader. But what is it that drives you on a very micro level as an individual? I think that'll go back to the core motivation of why founders build, and it'll be a great way to end this sublime conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think my motivation to start Darwinbox, Jivraj, right, obviously to be at it and do a little more, of course, is building a great global product from Asia. But to start was to solve a problem, right. My personal drive is in solving problems, right. And on a day in and day out basis, of course, as a founder and a company which is growing very quickly, you have hundreds of problems to solve.
Yeah.
So pick the most important one, and solving for them, I think, is something that I enjoy, right. And Darwinbox has presented so many opportunities to solve for exciting problems at scale, right, really well. And I think that keeps getting me back to work. What another learning, I think I do want to call this out because it's been a realization over the last few months for me, right, is McKinsey used to have only two values, right? Do right by the team and do right by the customer, right. I cannot tell you how much I resonate with it now, right. Like when I used to hear that at McKinsey, while I really liked it, I thought it is too simplistic to say these two things,
Yeah.
right. But if you actually think back, right, and now I feel it very strongly, right, doing right by your team and doing right by your customer is enough,
Yeah.
right. So I mean, just those two things is enough
Yeah.
to build a large company, to build a great company. So I think, yeah, that's been a big learning for me.
Fair enough. I think that's wonderful to hear and a great pointer to end the conversation on. I certainly have learned a lot, Rohit, through this one, and I thank you for being your candid self. This was absolutely awesome, and I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Absolutely did, Jivraj. Thank you for having me, and thanks for pushing me to reflect on a lot of things which I haven't about as much. So thank you.